Quando se tiver um retorno tema, vai ver here. Acho que talvez, na verdade, para ele, where is it? Because we're going to be here with you, and then we're going down to watch. So, well, it's better here because I can maybe have to look back. Yeah, that's what I thought. Costa. Alunos novinhos.
Ok, podemos começar. Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos. Queria dar as boas-vindas a todo mundo aqui. Inicialmente, dar as boas-vindas ao professor Keil, que vai ser apresentado em alguns minutos, meu colega João Tonucci, e eu sou Heloisa Costa, da Faculdade do Instituto de Ciências, Departamento de Geografia, e estou aqui também na condição de representar o professor Estevão Las Casas, que é o diretor do IEAT, Instituto de Estudos Avançados Transdisciplinares da UFMG, do qual também tenho feito parte nos últimos 3 anos. O professor Estevão não pôde estar presente, então vou tentar substituí-lo aqui. Então, queria só falar algumas palavrinhas dessa. O IEAT tem uma série de programas e de apoio a grupos de pesquisa, a pesquisadores e a recepção de professores e pesquisadores de várias instituições ao longo do mundo, por meio das cátedras, né? Esta cátedra era para ter acontecido em 2019, 2020, né? Nós fomos depois pegos pela pandemia e fico com muita satisfação de ver que ela pôde finalmente acontecer agora em 2023, né? O que nos deixa muito felizes. Antes de passar para o professor João Tonucci, para ele fazer a apresentação do professor Roger, quero só dizer rapidamente dos próximos eventos do IEAT. Agora, entre 24 e 26 de maio, de 9 da manhã às 9 da noite, nós temos um seminário que se chama Por uma Criminologia Euro- e Sul-Americana, de um projeto Erasmus Success, que é uma atividade do CRISP, que é o Centro de Referência em Segurança, em Investigação em Segurança. Isso vai acontecer nos auditórios da Fafiche. No dia 6 de junho, às 10 horas, no auditório do IGC, a gente tem uma outra cátedra, Fundep-IEAT, com a conferência que chama O Projeto Nós Propomos, a aposta internacional na cidadania territorial, e quem virá será o professor Sérgio Nunes, da Universidade de Lisboa. Depois, no dia 15 de junho, ainda em horário e local a definir, nós temos um seminário do The Good Food Institute, que é uma entidade sem fins lucrativos que financia projetos na área de proteínas alternativas. Então, esse e outras informações vocês podem encontrar no site do IEAT, que é www.ufmg.br/IEAT. E nas redes sociais, estou aqui fazendo uma propaganda, né? Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter. Vocês vão saber melhor lidar com isso do que eu. Então, dito isso, eu passo a palavra para o professor João Tonucci e agradeço a presença de todos.
Muito obrigado, Heloisa. Boa tarde a todas e todos. Uma satisfação ver esse auditório cheio aqui na nossa casa, na Faculdade de Ciências Econômicas. Eu vou apresentar brevemente o professor Roger Keil. O professor Keil já esteve conosco em 2016. Né? Nós temos colaborado há alguns anos em vários temas de interesse comum. Ele é professor da Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, na York University, em Toronto, no Canadá. Pesquisa suburbanização global,
ecologia política urbana, cidades e doenças infecciosas, infraestrutura e governança regional. Tem várias publicações, artigos, livros, vou citar alguns deles, os últimos livros: Suburban Planet, de 2018, After Suburbia, que saiu no ano passado, em 2022, Pandemic Urbanism, que é esse livro, imagino que ele vai comentar um pouco hoje sobre esse livro publicado esse ano, e um outro livro também recém-publicado, Turning Up the Heat, Urban Policy Ecology for Climate Emergency. Ele foi diretor inaugural do City Institute, na York University, e co-editor da International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, que é uma importante publicação na área de estudos urbanos e regionais. Com isso, eu queria agradecer imensamente a presença do professor Roger. Ele está aqui conosco durante 3 semanas, em uma série de atividades, tanto de exposições, falas, palestras, mas também de interações com grupos de pesquisa, estudantes, e queria falar que de quinta-feira nós temos uma última dessas atividades públicas, que vai ser uma palestra final do professor no auditório do Instituto de Geociências, sobre às 14 horas, sobre o tema de ecologias políticas urbanas. Então também estão todas e todos convidados a participarem. Então, sem mais delongas, passo a palavra com muita satisfação, e o professor Roger. Vocês têm a tradução simultânea, e depois a gente vai abrir para perguntas e um breve debate. Com isso, obrigado.
Boa tarde, muito obrigado for all the nice introduction. That's as much as my Portuguese will go today. Thank you to both of you for inviting me here, and to IEAT to have me here for almost 3 weeks for this very pleasant and productive stay, and I feel very well hosted, and I hope to contribute today with one of 3 talks that I'm giving here. And today we're focusing on the relationship of cities and infectious disease. I will try to speak slowly, and I'm sitting while I'm doing this because I broke my ankle 2 months ago, and I could stand, but not for 1 hour. So I sit down, which also means that I will have to sometimes turn away and see what's on here. So there is no discontinuity between what's on the screen and what I'm talking about. So having said that, let's go. Of course, the first 3 words on the screen for the translator are not English, but French, tout est possible, which you will be able to figure out. And these were an artist who started to spray paint bridges, buildings, public places during the pandemic. That they popped up everywhere, and they became sort of, for me, when I rode around the city on my bicycle, the motto that everything is possible, but also everything is not possible. We don't know, because nobody knew where and how this would end. So the question is, now, today, in May 2023, 3 years after, is this really after COVID? Well, just when I arrived here, on the day that I arrived, or a couple of days later, the World Health Organization declared the health emergency over. But funnily enough, my government in Canada sent me an email on that same day asking me for a booster shot, another vaccination for COVID. So something is not yet on the same page. So we do think the emergency is over, but the pandemic has lasting consequences. And that's what I want to talk about today, where it came from and what we can expect. And I'm not a medical doctor. I'm also not a public health person. I'm a political scientist working on urban governance and urban political ecology. So I'm not talking from the medical side about the pandemic, but from the side of an urban studies scholar. So we can say that it all started in Wuhan. That's as much as we know. Wuhan is a city that I bet the majority of the people in this room did not know existed in 2019. And if you knew that it existed, you probably wouldn't have been able to find it on a map, I think, unless I'm wrong and geography in high schools in Brazil is much better than where I come from. But the city of now 8 or 9, 10 million people. And we now all know where it is. And it's a city where we think with much certainty that this is where the pandemic started in December of 2019, just before the Christmas holidays. But what we don't know, and I'm not going to talk about this, whether it is the consequence of a lab leak in this Wuhan Institute of Virology, which some people believe may be the origin, or it could have come from the Wuhan fish market, seafood market, which you see on the right side of that picture. I will not get involved in this conversation. I don't care whether it came from the lab or from the market. It is important that it came from the city of Wuhan. But the question is, we know it came from a city, but how was it a disease of urbanization? Right? It's a disease from the city, origin in the city, but how is it a disease of urbanization? What we can say is that at the beginning of the century, at some point in 2006, the majority of humans lived in cities. So we can say that this is a network disease on an urban planet. And since we've had the declaration of the health emergency in March 2020, the disease has been running our lives individually, but it also has been running our cities. Our cities were governed to respond to the disease, but also to live with the disease. So what was considered normal urban life was under constant redefinition. We never knew. Every day, every week, there was another rule. 2 meters, shops closed, shops open, bars closed, bars open, schools open, remote teaching, remote learning. All of that changed on a daily basis. And beyond the natural evolution of the virus, many new variants since we first got to know this coronavirus, and the development of the vaccines to deal with this virus, a lot of things happened in those cities and changed the cities and changed the urban life that came along with it. It is very difficult for us to see that because we have slowly evolved with it. But if we were to be able to go back to our 2009 selves, we would not recognize our 2023 selves. We would not naturally know what a Zoom meeting is, for example, to make a very simple example, right? So human life itself, although encapsulated for the most part in modern, now often digital technologies, appeared vulnerable. And for most people, particularly in the West and in the North, in cities that have had sanitation, sewage, water, modern health systems, public health systems, in those cities, people never felt vulnerable of a disease like that. Yes, you sometimes got the flu or a cold, but you would get over it. But all of a sudden, we all felt vulnerable. So it was a common experience, to all of us, of urban living, that safety and security of the human body could be compromised. Collectively, that was a new experience. And that had been overlooked in the victorious representation of how far we had come as a human species. Like, in fact, in the 1960s, when I was a child, the American government at one point declared the age of infectious disease over. They thought we had captured and conquered and defeated infectious disease. Well, we were wrong. And what I'm doing is not talking about the disease, as I said, not as a biological or medical phenomenon. But for me, it's important to learn from this disease, from this pandemic, and from other pandemics in history to make sense of urban theory, which is what I do. And so I, like many others, here's a paper of mine, which actually was finished before the pandemic started. We had worked on, which you will see in a few minutes, I have been working on disease in cities for 20 years. So this didn't come as a surprise to me. We had just finished this paper on extended urbanization, the spatialities of infectious disease, at the time when this pandemic hit. So we were somewhat prepared, but also friends and comrades of ours who were working on similar questions here, like Neil Brenner and Swanab Ghosh, also subsequently started to put the event of the disease, the event of the pandemic into the larger context of theory building around the urban, to understand cities better through the disease, and in turn then to understand the disease better through cities. And we know for a while, is another old friend and comrade, Mike Davis, who had written a book in 2005, The Monster at Our Door, about the threat of pandemic bird flu. And he then quickly republished this book, which was called The Monster at Our Door. So it was still knocking. But in 2020, he republished and wrote a new introduction to the book, and he said, the monster enters. And that is this awareness of urban crisis and failure, infrastructure failure, disasters, fires, floods, all of those things have grown as the 21st century has moved onward. As we became an urban planet, we have also become more aware of our vulnerabilities. And this pandemic just adds to this. But, you know, floods, fires, those kinds of things also happen still. So what that meant is that we had to write alternative urban geographies, not geographies that were written from the point of view of the success of the urban world, but from the vulnerability of the urban world. And if you were around as students 20 years ago, the textbooks would be full with, stories about creative cities and how cities are the most important product that humanity has ever produced. And we cannot fail because this is so wonderful and we will all live in beautiful 15-minute cities. That was not what they said at the time. But we were born to be an urban species, and that was a good thing. 20 years later, 25 years later, we have to look at this more critically in a different way. What also happened, and you will hear more about this in a minute, is that at the turn of the century, 2000, the far majority of anything that was said about cities was written from the global south, even from the global north. Even what was said about the global south was mostly in the hands of researchers from the global north, who came to the south and then wrote books about it, in English mostly. And that was sort of a discussion that went on without the global south actually present. But in those first 20 years of the 21st century, we've had a turn, both in the sense that southern urbanism was a thing that could not be denied anymore. So it wasn't I started teaching in the 1990s, and I would always talk about Curitiba and, the buses and the invention. But that was the only example that was in any of the textbooks. It was the Brazilian cities. Then it was Porto Alegre about, participatory budgeting. Now, the world of urban studies is full of stories and experiences from the global south. But not only that, those stories are not told by people like me anymore, who is a German who lives in Canada, but it's told by people from the global south. So the challenge of southern urbanism happened exactly at the time as urbanization overall was considered to be more problematic than 20 years ago. What was important during that time is that while the 20th century was sort of a closing of boundaries of stories, that we thought we had ended history of the city. People thought that was the end of a certain history of urban development and urbanization, and often linked to industrialization as the only motivator of urbanization. Now, in the 21st century, we see a crossing of boundaries everywhere. So there is, and that's important for today, a crossing of animal and human boundaries. And you know, in many cities, like in the city where I live, in Toronto, you're not allowed to have farm animals or animals in the city because it's considered to be not sanitary, not clean, not hygienic. Right? For 100 years in the cities of the north, we've banned animals from the city. But we, of course, have many animals. Not only do we have pets, but we also eat animals. You know, it's not like they're not there. They're just in the slaughterhouse outside of the city. Right? But that boundary is so important because of a process called zoonosis. And zoonosis means, in a nutshell, again, I'm not a medical scientist, that a disease, whether it's, you know, caused by a virus or a bacteria or something else, jumps a species boundary from an animal to a human. It also works the other way around, but we don't concern ourselves so much with it. But it happens all the time between birds and us and pigs and us. You know, pig flu, swine flu, they say, bird flu. These are, of course, popular names for diseases. They have Latin names and names with many numbers. And that also happened with the coronavirus that we've just all had. Most of us had it because that's jumped from some exotic animal, most of them quite nice looking, but it could also be, you know, a bat or a raccoon dog or a civet cat, which caused the SARS virus. Bats caused Ebola, which I will talk about in a minute, and raccoon dogs are currently the favorite species from which a zoonosis has happened with COVID. This is one boundary that is being crossed, but there are many others between the developing and the developed world. Many more planes flying back and forth between the south and the north. Many more refugees and migrants. Right? The rural and the urban. Urbanization still, in terms of numbers, is a movement of people from the countryside to cities. The majority still is like that. Right? The majority is not natural increase of people making babies in cities. Right? Cities grow because people move to them, and often from the countryside, often from countrysides on another continent, not from a countryside inside the country. Then private and public, and from small, very tiny communities, parish, community, to the globe. These are boundaries that we cross all the time now. You come from one place, you get on an airplane, you are in another continent, right? So you constantly are aware of this. So these are the kinds of things that come with global urbanization. Now, in the past, diseases were also carried across these boundaries. Each disease that we've had, each pandemic that we've had, that we know about, that we, again, learn in school about, that those diseases have had certain geographies. And here you have, you know, the medieval plague on the left, the Spanish flu, the SARS epidemic, the third one in, and then COVID-19. And here you have, this is not my publication, it's somebody else's publication, but making the same point that I'm making today, is that COVID is the first pandemic in an urban world. Well, the plague in the 14th century also killed people in cities, but only 2% of the humanity lived in cities at the time. So you can't say the plague was a disease of the urban world. Even by the beginning of the 20th century, during the Spanish flu, only about 15% of people in the world lived in cities. So it was also not an urban world yet. Most of the people lived in the countryside. But today, COVID is a disease of the urban world. So some people said at the end of the 20th century that we had reached a point where the germ theory of disease had become general knowledge. Now we now know through many people who don't believe in it, they don't get vaccinated. Many people say, no, this comes from somewhere else. You know, this is still somewhere in the air or in the water. People have theories about it, but the majority of people, both scientists and mothers of little children or fathers, believe that the germ theory of disease is, a rational theory to hold on to, right? And during the 20th century, something interesting happened because of all the sanitary developments based on the germ theory that we now have, introduced clean water and sanitation and parks and all kinds of things. Hygiene methods, we turned something upside down, which was never the case. We, as a human species, were living healthier lives in the countryside and sicker life in cities until the 20th century, right? And that was turned around. But today, a lot of people here, like Tom Bollicki, an internationally known author who writes about global public health, just before the pandemic in 2019, said that the future of global health is urban health. Because we have to now think about us as a majority urban species. Now we have to think about health as an urban problem, right? That was before the pandemic, before we even had this particular problem. And then there's the long view. This was the 20th century. There's also the long view, right? I said that the urban settlements were still insular. In the industrial era, hygiene becomes a concern of these overcrowded working class quarters. Typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, infectious diseases pose a recurring problem. 5 years ago, 7 years ago, in your country, and I was going to study this if I had come here earlier, we had the problem of Zika, which was also associated with these kinds of conditions of the industrial city, or the city that is not quite yet entirely, sanitized or has the hygienic conditions that would, make Zika impossible. So many of the people who were affected by Zika were people in poor areas, poor neighborhoods, mothers who didn't have the ability to protect their newborn or their, emerging children from that disease, and that created a whole number of issues. And I'm using this example to say that this narrative that we collectively moved out of the industrial era into this urban era and made ourselves healthier people in cities, that of course is a very colonial attitude, because the majority of urbanization today takes place in informal settlements around the world. Most people live either in high-rise suburban neighborhoods in places like Shanghai or Istanbul, or they live in informal settlements around the world, right? Everywhere. More in the south than in the north, but it's not uncommon to have it in the north. So it's informal urbanization. And so those people who are moving into squatter settlements and informal settlements, barrios and favelas and so on, they don't have the sanitation necessarily with flowing water and all of that, right? So keep that in mind. When I talk about this history, I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying this is the story that is being told. All right, I just wanted to put that in because I know, this is on everybody's mind. But what has changed now at the beginning of the 20th century that is different from what we had in the 20th century and different from those tens of thousands of years before that we all lived on this planet? So we all live in an urban society, so the diseases we have are the diseases of an urban society. So when I said the disease originated in Wuhan, of course it didn't originate in Wuhan. It was brought to Wuhan after a zoonotic process. Some bat in some cave in southern China infected some other animal. That other animal might have been eaten or sold on that market. There are a whole number of processes by which the virus came from that bat cave or some other place into the market. This is what I said earlier. We know it's a disease of cities, but how is it a disease of urbanization? It is a disease of urbanization because if it weren't for urbanization, global planetary urbanization, we would not be in that bat cave, and we would not eat the animals from the forest. We would not dig in the jungles of Central Africa, we would not go to the Canadian North and, you know, create mines for everything. All the stuff that is now in our cell phones has to be brought from somewhere. That is the urban society that moves to those places and brings back the viruses, the infection, right? So we're not in the city anymore, but we're still in urban society. So the majority of urbanization today, as I said, began to take place in informal settlements in the 20th century, like in this image at the bottom that I took in Kampala, Uganda. Up there is the other example I mentioned that is on the European side of Istanbul. And the other thing is that whether we live in the city or not, even if we live in some sitio or some place outside of the city, we still live urban lifestyles. You can have Netflix and the internet in your sitio and in every village, right? So while we location-wise, geographically are still in the countryside, we have long transgressed to become an urban, to partake or participate in urban lifestyles. An important thing and part of the title of my talk today has to do with mobilities. We move around more, we move around differently. I took this because everybody knows what that is and where that is. That's one form of mobility. It's a micro-mobility. It brings people, I guess, brought people, because I think now they've discontinued these cable cars in Rio. But it brings people from the bottom sea level in Rio up to the favelas, right? It's a micro-mobility. And that's a speed up of some process. But what I want you to look at is those numbers here at the bottom. This is really significant. It's only 20 years. And look at the significant rise in the numbers of air mobility. So when SARS happened, which I'm going to get to in a minute, in 2003, 2 billion people flew around the planet. When COVID started, it was 4.7 billion. Right? You see the difference? Just the sheer number of people moving around, and they didn't only move around between here and Brasilia or here in Sao Paulo, they move around the globe, right? So there is more mobility and mobility across continents and oceans. So there are increased mobilities between the urban and non-urban worlds, again, as I mentioned in several examples, between central and peripheral mobilities, places that are considered central, like a downtown and a suburb, but it could also be something like a hotel and somebody's apartment somewhere else, right? So centralities and peripheries are defined in a new way through the ability to cross between them. And think about it, you know, how much has changed over the last few years. Now you can get anywhere in Belo Horizonte by just dialing, or not even dialing, you just put something in your phone and an Uber will arrive, right? That's a hypermobilization of an entire urban population. New urbanization in previously non-urban parts of the globe, very important. Now we have cities everywhere, in the mining areas in the north, in Central Africa, everywhere you want to see. You have new activities, forestry, food production, anywhere you want. You have the Amazon, the whole world talks about the Amazon. That is, we have the Canadian North, very similar kinds of ecologies, but one is tropical, the other one is not tropical, it's very cold, but it's the same kind of thing, right? So these kinds of relationships are sped up. And then there's new urbanization beyond the city, which means that not everything that looks non-urban is non-urban. I've already mentioned some examples. This, by the way, is the bus terminal in Kampala, Uganda. This is important as an image, because I don't have an image of the similar kind of thing in West Africa, but I will talk about Ebola. And one of the things that carried Ebola so quickly to the cities of Western Africa were these kinds of buses. And it was people who went home on the weekend to their village, worked in cities, then went home to a wedding or a birthday party, or because you know, they had to look after their mother or something, and went back and forth. And this is the kind of mobility that even 20 or 30 or 40 years ago would not have existed. You weren't able to go from some village in the bush to your informal settlement in the city, right? So think about mobility not in terms of only in terms of airplanes and Elon Musk's rocket ships. Think of mobility also in these very practical ways in which people have now learned to get around. So I'm going to talk briefly about 3 diseases that we've had since the turn of the century that all in different ways make the point I'm making theoretically. So the first one is severe acute respiratory syndrome, which is when I started working on this question of infectious disease in cities, happened in 2003. And Toronto, the city where I live, was one of the most affected ones. And then Ebola virus disease that I already mentioned, and COVID-19. So this is the book that anybody wants to have a look later, you can have a look, have a copy here. The book that we published, and we are talking about these 3 diseases with my colleagues, Harris Ali and Creighton Connolly. Harris is a colleague of mine at York University. Creighton is at the University of Hong Kong. So we, in this book, describe a changing urban world, much like what I've said in my opening remarks here. And there's an uncanny relationship, a remarkable, noticeable relationship between the spread of globalization and the spread of disease. Remember that I said by the end of the 20th century, until HIV/AIDS arrived, people thought we had conquered those diseases. But now you open the paper, if you still open a paper, you watch on television, you look at your Facebook news feed, or Twitter or TikTok news feed, and the first thing you will see is that, yeah, there's another infectious disease. In fact, this morning I woke up and I read an article about the spread of bird flu. Really dangerous now amongst wild birds. They're falling out of the air. It's a very apocalyptic scenario. It hasn't crossed the species boundaries to humans yet. But it's on the news now. We can't say it's not happening anymore. So these are the 3 events that I'm going to talk about, and we'll get there one by one. So the points to be made here is that SARS exposed the exoskeleton. You know, if you watch science fiction movies, you know what an exoskeleton is. It's a skeleton outside, right? Because it was like the shell of globalization 20 years ago. We just began to understand that China was there. You know, before that, people, just like we didn't know where Wuhan was, most people in the West didn't know what China was doing. It was behind a wall. People said it was a communist state there. It was far away. But 20 years ago, that changed, right? So all of a sudden, through SARS, which came from China, the exoskeleton of that economy, the global economy, was exposed. Ebola exposed the majority urban world. This was, for the first time, a disease that had never been in a city before, now became an urban epidemic, and it became an urban epidemic exactly where the majority of urbanization, the fastest paced urbanization has taken place in Africa, which is the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. And lastly, the SARS-CoV-2, the COVID epidemic, as we now call it, exposed the flesh and bones of global capitalism. And here's a great quote that somebody wrote right at the beginning of the pandemic. Wuhan is one of the newly discovered inner lands of the global production chain as the Chinese coasts have become more expensive. So Wuhan is an inner land now of global capitalism. It belongs to global capitalism. It's not outside some exotic place where they make iPhones and VW cars. This is now part of the capitalist global experience. It's part of us. It's where we get our stuff from, right? So it's not outside anymore. So it's the flesh and bones of the economy in which we all live. Right, so SARS. We call it a network disease in the global cities network. Even then I was working with my friend Harris Ali, and we went to Singapore, Hong Kong, and we live in Toronto, and studied these 3 cities. And we saw the connection between that disease and the spread of that disease and the global cities network, the command centers of the global economy. And that's a very different map. That's a map from the 1980s. That's a very different map. It's actually done by my colleague and my partner, Ute Lehrer. She drew this map. Thank you for this. This map is based on the 1990s. Right? There are certain cities that Wuhan is not on this map. Right? Certain cities that would now be on this map. But at the time, Singapore, Toronto, and Hong Kong are on this map. Right? And it was the connection, the connectivity between these global command centers, financial centers, cultural centers, that explained to some degree the spread of this but infectious disease, SARS. Right? Here's the micro spread out of a hotel, the hotel Metropole in Hong Kong. And you can see that there was a wedding, and some doctor from the mainland had come to this wedding in Hong Kong, and he stayed in this hotel, and then he was infected with this atypical pneumonia, which ended up being SARS, and he was the index patients for all these people that then flew to Toronto, to Vietnam, Singapore, Guangdong province, and many other places around the world, and spread this epidemic, which of course by today's experience was nothing, right? But 10,000 cases worldwide, 774 deaths, about 800 people died of it, 44 died in Toronto, which was a big number. It came out of the blue. People didn't think that people had to die. If you've ever been to a hospital in Hong Kong or in Singapore, they're like state of the art. People didn't think they could die from something like a pneumonia, something like that, right? And all of a sudden, everybody was on alert. And it created the same kind of panic and racism against Chinese people and all that at the time. But, look at the numbers. They are nothing compared to what we have now been through. Right? So there was a whole thing. When it ended in Toronto, the Rolling Stones gave a big concert, benefit concert, and it was a big thing and a big event in so many ways. But it was different from what we have now been through. But it gave us a warning of what could come. Everybody now knew what an emerging infectious disease was. We were not outside of that danger anymore. About 10 years later, something happened at the border of these three West African countries, Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone. The story goes that a child played underneath a tree, and a bat was in the tree and infected the child, and there was a zoonotic process with the Ebola virus. And Ebola, at the time, had been the star of the international literature on disease. And that was mostly, the result of a couple of books and a movie that were produced in the 1990s that painted Ebola as hyper deadly, and people, basically died of inner bleeding, and they had blood coming out of everywhere. And it was the most horrible thing that humanity could imagine that you could get. They now have changed this narrative. They're not talking about it as a bleeding disease anymore, but that, now we call it Ebola virus disease, and it has all manner of symptoms. It's often also, similar to malaria or Lassa fever, other types of tropical diseases that exist in Africa, but also, of course, in this subcontinent and in Asia. But it is a dangerous disease, and it kills a lot of people. When you get it and you get no treatment, you die. And in the past, that was the case, because it happened to small villages, isolated villages, and 40, 50, 60, 70% of the people who were infected died. But then it was done, because, 50% of the village die, that's it. There is no mobility between the village and something else, unless there's a war or a trade or something. But this was the first time it became an urban disease. And you see the numbers. This is not small village populations anymore. 30,000 people and 11,000 deaths, roughly, in those three countries. Right? And then the reason why we were looking at Ebola is because we had a grant from, again with my friend and colleague Harris Ali and others, we had a grant to study community responses in West Africa to look at the ongoing Ebola outbreak in 2018-19. So we went to West Africa to learn from people in those communities how they reacted and what did they do in the absence of good public health systems, in the absence of medication, and what did they do to protect themselves. We wanted to take the lessons and apply them in the Congo. And then, so some of our group, I didn't go, went to the Congo to, advise the Ministry of Health and the president and about what to do. And they got through to some degree with those lessons. So that's the history of me being involved in that. And here you have the heat map of urbanization in Africa. And you see that not only in the Great Lakes region there around Lake Victoria, but also in West Africa, you see how quickly urbanization happens in those countries. That's where the majority of urbanization now takes place in the world. So it is at the frontier of urbanization and infectious disease where Ebola becomes a major problem. So it becomes, disease changes from a disease in and of isolated rural environments to the disease of extended urbanization, and of course, like in the Congo, of violent conflict, because the conflict moves the virus around. That was also the case in West Africa, but more in the sense that all these countries were post-Civil War countries. So the societies were very hurt and violated at the time when the virus hit. These were not stable societies. So Ebola is the disease that brings an urban urban inversion, in that now we have a disease that used to kill people in the countryside begins to kill people in cities. All right. This is a quote from the time, 2015, in the middle of the crisis. The World Health Organization said, the virus never entered a community like West Point in Monrovia, the capital of Liberia. West Point is West Africa's largest and most notorious slum. More than 70,000 people crowded together on a peninsula with no running water, sanitation, or garbage collection. The number of Ebola deaths in that slum will likely never be known, as bodies have simply been thrown into the two nearby rivers. Terrible tragedy. I was there in 2019, and I took a lot of pictures that I'd like to show you, but my camera was stolen in the hotel, unfortunately, so I lost my chip and had no backup. So this is a picture of my friend Harris Ali while we were touring this neighborhood. 70,000 people on a small, that doesn't look like the favelas that you have on hillsides here. This is on a piece of sand in the Atlantic Ocean. And it's much poorer than most favelas here in Brazil. But it's also a kind of an informal settlement, vulnerable to that. This is in Freetown. Here it's more like favelas. In Freetown, which is the capital of Sierra Leone, one of the other, the three West African states. And here are some of the people we worked with. These are Ebola survivors. The gentleman in yellow was a community outreach worker who went door to door to do contact tracing. Who went where? When there was an Ebola case somewhere, who went where? Who might have infected whom? These were the kinds of things that happened in the absence of the global health organizations, the aid organizations, the American government, who were slow to respond to this crisis. The WHO was very slow to respond to this crisis. Well, people started to organize themselves. So this is a lesson. The lesson is informal urbanization, southern urbanism, the most rapid urbanization in the world, but at the same time, incredible innovation in those informal settlements of people protecting themselves and finding collective solutions to this tremendous crisis. And you know what? These communities were ready when COVID came, and they did exactly the same thing and started to organize themselves, and they knew how to wear a mask. We had to be told, right? They knew how to protect themselves and socially distance themselves. We had to be told. They already knew, so they were able to teach us, right? A very important lesson from this particular. So now we arrive at the thing that we all know, COVID-19, a picture from a hospital in Toronto. This now is, we're moving from global cities networks to southern urbanism, and now the third case is embedded in this global process of suburbanization or extended urbanization, which means that most urbanization is not centralized urbanization. Most cities that grow today don't look like Paris or Barcelona or even Belo Horizonte. Most cities today look much, much different. They also don't look like Los Angeles anymore. But they tend to be either more horizontal or much more vertical than what we've had over the last 50 years, right? And we've studied this, and I talked about this last week. We studied this in this project of 10 years with 50 people around the world. We were here 7 years ago to study this here with colleagues in Belo Horizonte. So what was hypothetical before 2020? We talked about these things as a hypothesis, that this could happen because we are living in a world of extended urbanization. But now it's experiential. We've been through it. We can say, yes, it did happen, and it might happen again, right? And we can now say empirically that the pandemic can be linked to urbanization because it was linked to the urban centers around the world in various ways. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. It was spread through the networks and infrastructures of urban society, not just city infrastructures, but the infrastructures of global urban society, air traffic, tourism. You may remember that one of the first instances of spread was there was a village in little town in Austria called Ischgl. It was a ski area, and people did après ski. Most of you probably don't know what après ski is because you maybe do après surf or something like that. But après ski is when you go to the bar afterwards, and then you get terribly drunk until next morning you get up again and you go back on the ski hill. Well, people did get very drunk and they hobnobbed and socialized amongst each other, and they all went home to England, to Norway, to Germany, and they took the virus with them. That was one of those events of connectivity. Urban society. Skiing is a pastime of urban society. People in the countryside ski too, but urban people come to the valleys of Switzerland and Austria to ski, right? And the effects of the pandemic, moving from origins to effects, the effects of the pandemic, who got sick and who died, showed the discrepancies in urban society, right? Because it was mostly poor people, racialized people, women, people in marginalized, precarious employment positions. They were the ones who were most affected. So the virus became a screen against which we could portray or project the discrepancies of our urban society. And again, if we wanted to do something about the effects of the virus, we had to look at it from an urban point of view. We get back to that. So suburbanization isn't just the movement of people from the city center to the suburbs. It now is a generalized process in which all kinds of urbanization processes are involved in, and a lot of suburbanization happens in areas where there hasn't been urbanization before, but also the suburbs of the 20th century are now urbanizing in unpredictable ways. They're aging, and they're not quite becoming cities in the sense of, again, Paris or Barcelona or cities like that, but they become something else and something different. There's relentless growth, there's extensive urbanization like here, or massive urbanization, high-rise buildings. I showed you the picture from Turkey. Increased mobilities, I've mentioned that. Overstretched cities, there's now, the cities grow into outside of their government regions, right? There's now people living outside of metropolitan areas, but they are still contiguous to the city. There are changing governance systems, and there are new socio-spatial disparities in those cities. So in the beginning of the pandemic, one of the things we said on the basis of knowing from our urban theoretical work that much urbanization now is peripheral urbanization, we came up with this hypothesis to say that COVID-19 is a crisis of the urban periphery. And we wrote a little paper about this in a health journal. And then we started looking at it empirically, mostly in Italy. And Italy was the first European country that had a crisis. And it was in the suburbs of Milan where that happened, in small towns in the metropolitan ring. And we looked at Toronto, where again, you see the same thing. And here's a map of Toronto, which I'm going to talk about in detail in a minute. So the social periphery was affected. The majority of people in the United States and in Canada who were affected by COVID, at least in the beginning, were people of color, were non-white people. And that is different in the United States from Canada because we have a different demographic mix, like Brazil has a different demographic mix. But you could see that white populations in all of the cities of North America were much less affected by that, for example. But that is just one social periphery. I took that out because many publications pointed it out. What was important about this is that in countries like Canada or the United States, health departments, public health departments were pressured by communities that were affected, racialized communities that were affected, to say, count us. We need numbers to show that this is the case. While in other places like France or Germany, that was not even on the radar screen of policymakers. Not that there are no non-white people in France and Germany, quite the contrary. But it was not a political issue to the same degree. So in order for us to see the periphery, we need to name it. And the pandemic became a way in which we saw our cities differently. The spatial periphery. This is a map of the city of Toronto, and the darker blue areas is where we have high-rise neighborhoods that house mostly poor renters, often immigrants, all of those areas in those high-rise communities, and 50% of Toronto's population live in high-rise buildings. Looks not quite as Belo Horizonte, but there are similarities. There's a lot of high-rise buildings. And many people in those so-called inner suburbs are renters, new immigrants, and they're racialized. And it's there where you see a lot of the hotspots. It's in towers like the one you see here. Right? So this is outside of the city of Toronto in a suburb called Brampton. If you heard me talk about suburbs last week, I talked a lot about Brampton, and I said I would come back to it. The city of Brampton, now 700,000 people, a booming suburb, mostly inhabited by new immigrants, mostly from South Asia. And here you had a hotspot. And this community, L6P, is a postal code, was the worst hotspot of them all. It turns out that in the beginning, people said these are cultural factors. These South Asian communities live in large families. They have Diwali celebrations, and they have this and that and the other. They can't stay away from one another because they're so close-knit as communities, which was all bullshit, nonsense. That was just racialized, cultural talk. In reality, these were the people who were working in the factories side by side, in Amazon warehouses, who drove the trucks. Right? So there was another explanation. Also, the community of Brampton is, of all the cities in the province, which is like your state of Ontario, with the lowest per capita spending on health. So they had only one hospital. Healthcare was very badly funded in that city. Those were the real explanations, not the culturalist explanations. So again, we learned something about how to even look at the disease as an urban disease, and it's all linked. On the left, you see the percentage of households, again, now in the city of Toronto, in core housing need. Again, the majority of those are in the inner periphery, right? Not in the center of the city. And here you see the close contact cases of COVID per 1,000. There's an overlap to some degree. And here you have the opposite, but still the same picture, which is the rollout of the vaccines. those areas that were most affected, were the hotspots, were those that had the least access to vaccination. And the example here is that you see on the right side, that red ring, that is in the hotspot. This is where there is not a single pharmacy in that area where you could walk in and get a vaccination. While where we live on the lake, there were 3 or 4 pharmacies that we could have walked in and gotten a vaccination. Right? And this is where the majority of the population is white, upper middle class, and you see the discrepancies. And people were so unconscious and so slow to begin to understand how that is. Another one, very important. Who can work from home and who can't, right? Here it's exactly the inverse. Now the dark purple are the places where people were able to work from home. And you see now that the light areas are exactly the places where people were infected, because this is where you have all the service workers, the nurses who work in the hospitals, right? The low-wage workers, the factory workers, they live in those kinds of neighborhoods, right? It's pretty clear, right? You don't need a PhD in urban studies in order to figure that out. And in fact, these maps were produced by journalists because the state, the government, wasn't aware of these issues. So, critical journalists came up with these maps and said, look, they went to the ministry and they said, look, this is the situation that we have to deal with. And then lastly, the institutional periphery. This is maybe not as common in Brazil or in other countries, but in Canada, out of 50,000 people who died, 22,000 people died in long-term care homes. That was a disaster. Basically, the government gave up on its old people. They didn't protect the old people in the institutional environments. And also, you can count this as an institutional environment, the unhoused. Morador de rua. True? Right. And here on the left, they put some glass cages into a gymnasium to put the homeless in there. Right? So it's an institutional environment. So these were very badly protected people, and there were a lot of people who suffered in these kinds of environments. And remember, we have winter and it's cold. So quickly, let's talk about, this was what happened. We went through, all of us, in various ways. So how do we deal with this afterwards now, if we're coming out of this lockdown urban world? So I have a project with colleagues, Phil Harrison in Johannesburg and Shu-Fei Ren in Chicago. We're currently looking at how these 3 cities have reacted to the pandemic, to learn and these are very different countries, South Africa, Canada, and the United States. How did these cities react? So we're in the middle of this, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but we wrote a little piece about lockdowns. Just looking at how these 3 countries or cities dealt with lockdowns gave us a huge variety between total lockdown in South Africa, hardly any lockdown in Chicago. Remember, this was the time of Trump, and sort of something in the middle in Toronto. And so what we came up with as a result is that these lockdowns were not great because they did all the things, they killed all the things that cities do well. They are necessary in some situations, but they're not the only way in which we can fight these diseases. And remember, I talked to you about what happened in West Africa. There are other ways to deal with this, more democratic ways, more bottom-up types of ways. And again, I can send you the link of this piece. You can have a look at it. I don't want to spend too much time on it. So much of the urban governance that we had during the pandemic was actually anti-urban. It didn't mobilize urban society in its positive ways. It created a military-type solution, a top-down solution. Of course, most visibly in China. Right? China was locked down at the beginning of last year, completely. So what we said instead is, many researchers got together and said, we need to look at fighting pandemics from the point of view of the cities, to see like a city. So in order for us to move to recovery And post-pandemic, we need to see like a city. Cannot look like a state, like a government of the state, like the military from top down. We need to see like a city, like people in cities, from the point of view of living in cities. Right? So we said, I'm one of the many co-authors of this piece, we said, rebuilding cities post-COVID requires negotiating multiple concurrent needs in order to meaningfully address the complexity of how contagion, sustainability, and economic recovery work in an urban settlement. Right? So it is a very complex process. A lockdown or something like it doesn't do all these complex things. And the Canadian political scientist Warren Magnuson, of whom many of us take our clues here, he said the city has no clear boundaries and no particular scale. The city is a series of tracings and scalings, unmappable except from within. So we can only understand the problem of the city, the problem of urban society, from within. We need to start from urban life. And urban life, remember, is what we were concerned about in the pandemic. So we have to understand the pandemic from the point of view of urban life. So there were some contradictions in here, and I just point out one, that the COVID pandemic swept, this is Matthew Gandhi in one of his latest books, the COVID-19 pandemic has swept through community after community, especially in the global south, exposing pre-existing patterns of poverty and ill health. The fetishization of the ecological city that also came to the fore during COVID, more bicycle paths, more bicycle infrastructure, healthier cities, that fetishization of this process didn't actually address what I've been talking about for the last, 45 minutes, I hope, not more, which is that the city is bigger, or urbanization is bigger than the city. If we want to address the diseases of urbanization, we need to go beyond these ideas of creating just different city environments. So we need to also learn from elsewhere. We need to look at the global south, particularly in the north. We need to learn from southern urbanism. And we need to change the governance of our cities. Again, friends here from Sierra Leone. Diane Davis from Harvard suggested that we need greater sovereignty at the urban scale. So not just the community, but also metropolitan government needs to be strengthened, because Milan and Toronto, those were the affected places. Montreal, all cities with them. Manaus was one of them, right? Very early in the beginning, very affected by it. So this M thing is a joke. It has nothing to do with the city starting with an M, but it is those large metropolitan cities that need new forms of governance, and the ingenuity and solidarities of the urban communities that we need to learn from, right? It's all about the way we live, and this is just for you. If you see my city, our city in the snow, that's what we lived through. So one of the first things that people did, of course, was go outside, because you could be outside. In the middle of the winter, even then, people started to surf the lake in the middle of the winter with wetsuits on. So in the end, the post-pandemic city must live up to the demands of a substantive, redistributive democracy. It needs to be democratic, it needs to be just, democratic and fair. If we don't do this now, the next pandemic is going to hit us exactly the way this current pandemic has hit us. So we're left with the important insight that proactive approaches, things we do before the pandemic hits, are more successful than the downstream approaches that we hastily put into place when the pandemic happens. Let's be proactive. Now that the WHO has declared this pandemic over, let's look at how we can prepare ourselves for the next one, right? And then we need to do all those things that came out that were lacking: housing, transportation, jobs, governance and power, environment, and public health. And of course now, we need to address the trauma, right? If your high school was anywhere like mine, you learned a lot about the First World War and how it changed the world, but nothing about how the Spanish flu changed the world. What did the families do? You know how many people died? Up to 80 million people died in the Spanish flu. What did the families, the 80 million families worldwide, do when their loved ones died? Have you ever read anything about that? No, you've read a lot about what happened to, soldiers, and they died, they were wounded in the war, and then it led to the Second World War. But we didn't learn so much about the trauma of the Spanish flu of 1918. So we now need to be aware that there are people amongst us who have long COVID, who have businesses that were destroyed, careers interrupted, women who were beaten up by their husbands because they stayed at home. They had to stay at home with their husbands, and they got angry and drank and beat up their wives. This is the trauma that we now have to think about and deal with. And all of these are urban issues, right? So we need to think about that. So also we need to recognize that in the end, what helped us in getting through this pandemic is that the periphery, the social, spatial, institutional periphery, organized itself. These are the people in that community that I spoke about earlier, Brampton, who after they had no vaccinations, too few vaccinations, it was those kinds of communities where people came together and volunteered on weekends. Doctors and nurses who worked all week in the hospital then spent their weekends vaccinating people in these environments. And people came, and it was religious institutions, social institutions, labor organizations who helped organize it. And we must not forget that this happened. And here, because we're in Brazil, I can talk about football. This is the coach that coached the German team to the World Cup in 1954. My father's generation. That guy used to say, before the game, after the game is before the game, right? Very important. The moment it ends, 90 minutes, you think about the next game, right? That's how we need to deal with the pandemic. That's how he beat the Hungarians, by the way. Because he told them after the German team lost 3-8 in the opening round, in the final, the Germans beat the Hungarians 3-2. And it was on the basis of this motto. So let's be a little bit like the German team of 1954 and beat the next pandemic. Before, after the pandemic is before the pandemic. Let's know about it. So, last thing, it'll happen again. But the next time it'll happen, it might be next year, in 10 years or 100 years. There's one excuse we don't have: innocence. We cannot, everybody who's alive now, every single person, whether they had the disease or not, whether you were ill with it or not, whether you were feeling as crappy as I did when I had it last year or not, you will remember this. You will tell your children, you will tell your grandchildren, what happened in 2020. We must not forget, and we don't have the excuse of innocence. So we need to be prepared for what's going on. That's the last word. My colleague and friend Phil Harrison from South Africa said, lessons of history need to be translated cautiously. That's different. 1918 is different from 2020. And Brazil is different from Canada. Translated cautiously across temporal context. But that history does direct us to themes, including the unpredictable course of most epidemics. When they start, we don't know where they're going. And this was also shown here. The huge variability in the spatial patterning of epidemics. Who will be affected? Where will they be affected? The significance of governance across all scales, from the community to the World Health Organization, in shaping the course of epidemics, but also the effect of epidemics on shaping the continued evolution of governance, the economic and social consequences of epidemics, the political consequences, and more. That's our task. It's in front of us. Let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eu fui avisada agora que nossa tradução termina agora. Então, João e eu vamos tentar traduzir as questões se elas forem em português. Ok? Então vamos. Não sei.
Did you hear anything from this?
No.
No?
So we're just being told that it's translated. It's over now.
So we are going to do it.
Thank you very much to the translator too. Thank you.
Acho que a gente pode abrir, né?
Nós vamos abrir perguntas, comentários, enfim, curiosidades, etc. Quem quiser perguntar diretamente em inglês, fica à vontade. Quem quiser em português, eu e a Heloisa estamos aqui para tentar traduzir. Então fiquem à vontade. Alguém quer começar?
I thank you very much. It's not clear to me why you say that isolation is not effective. I mean, what's the data? Is it the same number of infected people in cities that were isolated as opposed to the ones that were not? Because what we saw here was that people were catching COVID when they went to parties or nightclubs or clandestine, bars and stuff like that.
Okay, very interesting. The speech, I just thought about that some things are very special in Brazil, because from my observations, people can disagree. But it started as a white disease. It started from travelers coming from Europe and from China, which had been isolated in the airport. And afterwards, through the contacts here in Brazil with workers, servants, the disease spread. And of course, it was clear that in the peripheries, the disease was disastrous. I think you have to think about the inequalities in a globalized world, which is only for a few, which are traveling throughout the world and bringing the diseases to the marginalized people. This is one aspect which was very clear here in Brazil. On the other hand, the response in Brazil was also a miracle. We had a government which didn't take care, which boycotted any activity to avoid the disease. But the health system in Brazil, the SUS system, made an extraordinary job because they, as soon as they had the vaccine, 2 months later than the rest of the world, they started vaccination. Initially, they not even had needles for the vaccination. It was not only the vaccine which was missing, it was also the needles to apply the vaccination which was missing. And the oxygen was missing. Also, so it was a complete disaster from the material aspects of the healthcare system. But when vaccination started, the rates of vaccinated people were faster than in Germany and Europe. People were really open for vaccination. Meanwhile, others, maybe because they thought if they got COVID, they will have a possibility to be treated in a hospital. They have the luxury not to vaccine. It was in Germany like that. But even in Germany, the health system broke. But here, the people not even want to get this disease, so they are more open for vaccines. And it's impressive because even in the indigenous people in the Amazon had been vaccinated before a big part of the population in Europe. And these are aspects which might be very interesting to analyze, because it has to do with self-organization, what was said here, of the Brazilian society mainly in the periphery. Of course, we had the problem, that's a housing problem, and everything what we are discussing in equal or urbanization could be evidenced by new data from these vaccines. So that's it.
Alguém mais? Ah, tem mais um.
Som, ok. Eu acho que eu vou falar a pergunta em português, porque aí talvez facilita, evita de ter que ficar traduzindo. Aí vocês só traduzem para ele depois, vou deixar livre para vocês. Eu queria saber se existe algum compilado com algum resumo, compilado das experiências que vocês notaram, creio que na comunidade em Serra Leoa, que endereçou, né, esse trabalho em favor de enfrentar a Covid, respeitando também e acompanhando esse estilo de vida mais urbano. Então, existe algum compilado que vocês puderam fazer para servir de inspiração para outros espaços, que são a maioria no mundo, né, urbanos aí, que poderiam, então, enfrentar de uma maneira melhor a outra pandemia que vier?
Yes, he's asking if you know of any compiled data about Serra Leoa, of the things that they've done that support the actions that they had, and that could be an example for next pandemics or next other countries. And if
Yeah, that's a very specific question. If you want, I can. If you give me your email, I can send you a few papers that have been written about this. It's mostly the kind of community networks that were done in both Monrovia and in Freetown, in other cities too. But these are capital cities that are very big and outsized compared to these very small African countries. And so the communities, they're organized along social lines and territorial lines, and did contact tracing, did organize the provisions to the houses that were affected, that were isolated. But there's a whole list of things that I'd be happy to share with you. Some of them are pretty obvious, like the ones I mentioned. And they were very organized also. And what also was important, it went through all layers and levels of society, both in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. So it was not something that stuck just at the community level, but there were also medical doctors who were working in the government, who were working with these communities, but also, of course, they were working with the International Health Organization. As soon as there was something flown in, it was also distributed to those communities, right? So I'm not trying to evade this, but it's a lot of technical things that I can give you some references. People have studied this amongst us. We have studied it and written about it together with the people who were involved in those kinds of activities. Thanks. Find it in the book. Yeah, it's in the book. Yeah, there's a whole chapter on Ebola, and we talk exactly about this, and we speak of these experiences on the basis of the research that we did with and on those communities. Right? Yes. So it's in here, but it's also in. If you don't have access to the book, I can give you accessible materials that people have written about this. With the question of isolation, I didn't say isolation is not effective, not at all. Isolation is very effective, but it doesn't have to be organized in the form of a lockdown. And it's not my preference. I actually, I'm German. I like stuff that's organized by the government most of the time. Like it's in somehow my DNA to say, oh, what does the government think? How do we do this? It's not lockdown. To me, I had conversations at the beginning of the pandemic in which I said, oh, lockdown's a great idea. And we all happily went into lockdown situations. And we were actually in Germany when it started. I was on sabbatical and had to return to Canada, every time I gave an interview, I said, this is a good idea. People need to stay separate. But when we're saying it didn't work, it didn't actually do what it was supposed to do. It didn't mobilize things as well. For people to stay separate, it isn't that the government has to tell them to stay separate necessarily. There are other ways to organize that. So I'm all for isolation and I'm all for physical distancing and all of that, absolutely necessary, and close down places and all of that. There could be a conversation about whether it was useful to shut down the schools as long as they did in like our jurisdiction. They were closed forever. People were driven crazy by having the kids at home. So maybe there were other ways to organize this. But on the whole, these top-down, drastic military-style measures, that's what we think is problematic. And particularly in South Africa, where people really suffered. People really had a terrible time being at home and business, particularly in these cities, like in the informal settlements of the South African cities, as in many of your informal settlements here, people's economies rely on face-to-face contact, on stuff that is being traded, services that are being exchanged. I'm an academic. I can work on my computer at home. You can put me anywhere and I will keep on working. But if you're a street trader, a hawker, somebody who has to sell stuff, you can't do it. And how many people in South Africa were put out of work? And the government didn't have enough money to give these people. When you were unemployed in Canada, you got $2,000 per month, right? The government, before the pandemic, said we don't have any money. So they said, stay at home, we lock you down, but we give you $2,000. You can order stuff from Amazon. That people in South Africa didn't have that option. So that's why we're pointing out it's a necessary, temporary thing that needs to be done, but it cannot be the only one. We cannot always rely on it. And I'm with you totally. It's like it is a necessary thing that we need to do, but you can achieve isolation in other ways. Clemens's points, things were special everywhere, which is exactly why we need to study it. Brazil was different from Canada. I said that. So interesting, I can come back to West Africa. You said it was a white disease. It's exactly the same in Monrovia and in Freetown. The first ones who were infected were the people who had come from shopping trips to London, right? And Paris. Brussels is because these are the airlines that fly, right? Sabena or whatever flies to West Africa. So everybody goes to Brussels. The people who were first sick were people in the rich houses who came back. But you know what? Then the people who worked in the white people's houses, in the informal settlements, carried the disease to the informal settlements. What was interesting, though, is that during Ebola, it was the other way around. The white, richer people, who are generally wealthier people, there's also wealthy non-white people who had traveled to London and to Paris, were infected by when their maids and cleaners and food providers and gardeners came from the informal settlements. So it was actually inverted in those two cases. But one could learn in both cases from the interrelation between these communities, which often are not seen because, like in your buildings here and many buildings in Toronto, where you have two kinds of elevators, I saw one yesterday. Not the first time I saw one of those, but I was reminded of it yesterday because the service personnel goes up one, the owners of the apartments go up the other, right? So that became clear in the pandemic that we're connected. And, the wealthy person can travel to London and go shopping, but it's not protected from the disease. So that is a very important thing. The other point is about, the failure of your federal government. I'm not going to comment on this. It's your problem. We have a federal government too, which actually behaved quite well. But the one just south of us, of course, was a total disaster. And often people said there were some similarities between your country and that country south of us, with that president whose name I will not name. I've mentioned it before. And of course, he failed exactly like yours. And then it is these incredible examples that we have from New York City and Chicago and Los Angeles, where communities organized very similarly to how I talked about the cities of West Africa. You know, it was the poor people's communities, churches, temples, you know, religious groups, labor organizations that organized and helped people in the pandemic. And then when Biden came in, he just poured the money into the local communities. Just ending now, I think today or tomorrow, the federal funding will end in the United States, and we'll see what happens. So it was two things happening at the same time. The ingenuity of the local communities, of the urban society that I've been talking about, and also, of course, money, money, money. There had to be funding. People had to be supported. And that was sometimes taken up. I quoted Diane Davis, who wrote a very important paper about this. It was taken up in some cases, like here in Brazil, in the United States, or in Canada, and also in parts of Europe by metropolitan governments or regional governments. That was the case, and it got a lot of people through in Hungary and, you know, places where they just had very, you know, denied people like in power who denied that there was a problem. Then the community started to organize at other scales. It didn't always work, but you're right. One has to look at it in a differentiated way. And I didn't say there was only one way. There were many, many, many different ways. And doesn't even include you know, the kinds of governments we don't know so much about, like Russia, right? Now we know more about Russia than we want to know, but during the pandemic, people were wondering what's going on in Russia, what's going on in China. We now know what went on, and people suffered because for months they couldn't leave the house. And again, this was the opposite of what your government did here. The government said, this is what you're going to do. You're going to stay at home. We're going to deliver some food to you. And this is how it's going to be, right? It's going to, and organized by the Communist Party. I have colleagues in China who are professors at universities who found themselves in hazmat suits going from door to door to organize stuff. That's how China organized it, right? So it's a very strong state as opposed to the Bolsonaro and the other guy in the United States. And right, so there is a spectrum, and we need to think about how that affects the future and how we're going to deal with it as we are entering potentially new issues that come our way.
Mais questões?
Only for clarification, I was impressed that the SUS system, the health system of Brazil, it's a public institution, but they worked against the government. And the people who applied the vaccine, this, I think, had a crucial role in mobilization and self-organization. That was not clear in my question. And in that sense, I think we need to look how this self-organization works. And here in Brazil, we could have a starting point to research these people of SUS, which were very engaged, putting their lives in risk to save other people's lives. This is very impressive because I had some students which are working in SUS and they told me how they went house to house to convince the people to get the vaccination, something like that.
Yeah, and also, fully understood, and that's very important to say that. And, we had similar conflicts in Canada. In fact, the guy who ran the outbreak response in Ontario started to cry during an interview on public radio because he knew the government wasn't listening to what he said they were supposed to do. So we had these conflicts there too. The other thing that is really important in was important here and was important in Germany and other places, Canada to some degree, is that, and I had 2 or 3 slides and I took them out because it was already long, but is of course, the mobilization of irrational behavior during the pandemic, disinformation and misinformation, right? And of course, it was the moment of the conspiracy theorists and all of that, which made it very difficult for medical people, public health people, the government, people like us, to get through to certain communities. And they were pushing against vaccination, they were pushing against public health measures. So the question of isolation, for example, often was pushed back against by people who said, you are taking away my freedom, right? I want to go shopping. And, so it wasn't just the government. There was also, of course, communities themselves, often for political, ideological, religious, other reasons, were behaving in irrational ways. If you believe in the germ theory if you don't believe in the germ theory of transmission of diseases, there's nothing that can save you, because I can't convince you to say it's necessary to isolate yourself if you don't believe in it. But even people who believed in it started to organize against the government because they felt it was more important to keep their freedom of moving around than being sick. And even worse, it wasn't about them being sick. It was they lost the sight of endangering the weaker parts of our population, the aging, the sick, the disabled, the children. What, for example, if the next pandemic doesn't kill old people, but young people? What do you think is going to happen, right? So we need to think about the social fabric also, not just the government or the health system as institutional actors, but also how do we organize ourselves, how do we speak about each other, and how do we organize solidarities amongst each other in the absence of such solidarities in the time of neoliberalism, right? I think there's a response. Did you want to respond? No, sorry.
I just wanted to make a comment about join 2 things that you said, since we have lots of students here. The first one is that we didn't strongly market hash. I continued talking about that. But it was seen like something as a disaster that has ended and would never come back.
Mm-hmm.
And now we see that we are wrong. And connect this with the idea that we had many experiences of housing association organizations or neighborhood organizations in poor areas, in favelas, etc., that played a very important role together with SUS, and they could try to organize isolation and distributing food and water and soap and this sort of things. And there are some studies now that compare the rate of diseases, of deaths and people infected in those areas and in the neighborhoods just next door. Mm-hmm. And they are very important. And maybe we should go back and understand more how they work and all this sort of things too. Perhaps to prepare for the next. I hope that we don't have the next, but not to have the same mistake we did 100 years ago.
Right.
Yes.
Very good point.
I just add something to that, which Heloisa mentioned. I think also connects to what previously was asked about this mapping of experiences, right? I think that's also what the student was asking. And there has been some local, regional mapping of experiences of communities dealing. Like I know that Praxis, the research group from here, connected to IEAT has done this for the metropolitan region of Belo Horizonte. I know that on Habitat, UN Habitat has also done some kind of thing. So there might be some more possibilities of looking for this kind of. The Urban Health Observatory, also a research group from here. But what I wanted to add, this Heloisa mentioned this bottom-up initiatives and people trying to do this, but they were mostly located at where people were living, right? So it was mostly connected to housing. Yeah. And what some research found, especially in São Paulo, they did really good in terms of identifying that despite the fact that we thought in the beginning it was all related to density, like density in informal settlements are usually higher, and people live like larger families in smaller places without sanitation and so on. But the most important factor to explain why Black peripheral people were more deadly targeted, infected by the disease was mobility, transportation, public transports. So that question of housing and mobility comes as very important to understanding how COVID was unequally distributed in Brazilian cities. So,
yeah, same in Toronto. The buses were full at 5 o'clock in the morning with people that are going to work in the factories. But strangely enough, in contrast to what everybody predicted, is that there are very few cases that have been reported worldwide of transit being a vector of infection. But it was work that was the problem. And overcrowding more than density, right? So you can be in a dense environment and live comfortably in a condominium, or you can be living, in an overcrowded community of single-family homes. It doesn't say anything. So.
I just want to complement something because I work in a research project about the solidarity networks, and we map these experiences in Rio de Janeiro. So it's very interesting to see that many things that people have done in Rio to combat COVID, social movements and other stuff, it's very similar to what are you saying about Freetown. And I just started to say, because I'm a huge football fan as well, and we used to paraphrase a soccer player saying in português that não me dê uma problemática porque eu tenho uma solucionática, which translates to don't give me a problematic because I have a solutionatic or something. And I think that's very interesting because people often find ways to face the problems that they are facing at the time. Yes. But I just wanted to say this.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Alguma questão final? A gente já está se aproximando aqui do nosso tempo limite. Roger, do you want to say something else?
Thank you for your patience. I know I spoke for too long and then gave long-winded answers, but thank you for your interest, and I'd be happy if you email me if you want me to continue the conversation. Please do. All right. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, pessoal. A gente vai encerrando aqui. Convidamos vocês novamente, para quem tiver interesse, para a última palestra que vai acontecer no Instituto de Geociências, quinta-feira, às 2h, no auditório. O e-mail do professor Roger está ali. Eu e o professor Heloisa também estamos disponíveis aí para quem quiser manter o diálogo. Muito obrigado. E thank you very much again, Jose, for this and for all your time here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.